Good morning. So we have a very similar situation to yesterday. We've got a high pressure here. It's kind of extending a little bit further, but that's all right. And that gives us a really nice easterly driver down the English Channel, so through Dover, and that's kind of our main kind of gradient wind through there, and then up and round. So it kind of shoots through the eastern Solent in a reasonably sensible way, and that's quite important for the general kind of synoptic drivers for the day. We see this low is obviously reasonably close, but it's not doing much. It's still reasonably contained with the fronts, and yeah, generally not super worried about the influence of that for the next couple of days, which is great. Obviously, that can be a challenge for another time. Sorry about that. We had a pretty slippery mouse. So, looking at Hillhead, it actually makes more sense to look at the Eastern Solent first. So, looking at the Eastern Solent, we've got a pretty big right shift to begin with, just before 10 o'clock. And you see that kind of coming up to 10:30, 11 in the Eastern Solent, we keep getting that gentle right shift until about midday when it stabilizes all the way until the kind of early evening. And that's reasonably important because we're looking to kind of settle from a northeasterly direction to a southeasterly direction as that temperature stabilizes. And I hate to call these a sea breeze because it's not the same as a traditional sea breeze where you have some land, you have some clouds, and you get that convection. It's quite different, and the way that we're going to look at this is by thinking about the sea surface temperature being around 19, 20 degrees, maybe a little bit higher in places. And what that does is that holds the key to the wind unlocking. And we want that temperature to equalize before we start seeing that settling in the building. And you can see that around this time, so 20, 21 degrees, we start to see that clocking round, and that's basically the breeze unlocking rather than a sea breeze building. We have kind of traces of a sea breeze where we're getting a 2 knot influence, but that's a thermal enhancement rather than a traditional sea breeze that we would expect. And yeah, that's reasonably important. And I keep getting told that we're getting these big sea breezes, and it's more nuanced than that. So yeah, I appreciate the input, and I love the old questions, but yeah, it's a little bit more complicated, sadly. Well, not sadly, it is what it is. But yeah, so generally reasonably confident in the Eastern Solent. My big worry is the directional change that we have kind of 10, 11, 12-ish. And then in the afternoon, I'm quite happy that that's reasonably settled. And you can see that we see that build around so the stabilization and then the little build at midday, which we can probably attribute to a little bit of sea breeze. And then we see a gentle drop into the evening from kind of 5 o'clock, which we're not super worried about. The worry here is that if we don't get that sort of thermal enhancement, possibly because of clouds or it just doesn't develop in the way that we expect it to, we might not get these peaks, and therefore it'll start dying off a little bit earlier, so that kind of ends up looking a little bit flatter and then dropping off earlier. Directionally, this is our moneymaker. We're waiting for the breeze to stabilize. So that right shift clocking round is really important. Wind shear is pretty unexciting, I want to say, and the kind of 4 or 5 degree left shift that we see here, I'd probably say is the kind of breeze lingering a little bit round here. So again, I get a lot of questions about this, and frankly, the best answer I can give is, okay, your mast isn't 50 meters, but it's really useful to know what's going on there, because if you get a gust, that will tend to mix downwards. So as the gusts kind of propagate, we start to see a mixing of those layers. So we end up kind of meeting somewhere in the middle potentially. So the gusts would start to shift left, for example, at 2 o'clock, whereas in the morning they could potentially shift right. And obviously this is worth checking, but it's a reasonably good indicator for that. So we're going to look at Hill Head again, or the central Solent, and what we can see here is a slightly later build, a little bit less confidence there, and a slightly bigger step change. So you can see it's a little bit snappier between 90 and 130, and that will be sometime between 10 and 11. It's pretty hard to tell when that's going to come in, but that is really important to kind of build our day. Not quite as windy early on, but we see it a little bit later. And again, that's kind of just that breeze propagating. And yeah, the indicators are generally in the eastern Solent, and this follows rather than using it as a separate kind of forecasting site. Again, reasonably low confidence in that step change, and generally pretty happy up until 4 o'clock. 5 o'clock starts to get a little bit iffy, and then we get that drop off. But again, we're looking at kind of 10 knots. Worst case, that's going to be about 6 at 4 or 5 o'clock, and that's really important for us to kind of register and understand. I need a slightly better mouse, don't I? The Western Solent is a bit of a jumble sail from 11 o'clock onwards. We see a big right shift until about 2, and that's pretty painful, to be honest. So that turns everything into a wind shadow, and we start to see especially near the island shore, a very similar sort of synoptics, or not synoptic, but a very similar kind of setup to what we would see at Norris in a westerly. So we start seeing quite big gusts. It becomes quite patchy, and yeah, personally, I find that a little bit interesting to run racing in. So that's kind of where that comes from. Obviously, the closer to Lymington you get, the better it will be, and just because of the fetch. And so yeah, it'll stabilize a little bit. I've kind of forecast somewhere in the middle, and yeah, we can see it dropping off pretty significantly, and we've got the tide taking us down that way as well. So it's a little bit of a cocktail, which could be reasonably interesting. And yeah, the graphs are pretty telling. So we see that big right hand shift and then the gentle left shift once we've kind of recovered from that. And wind speed wise, it falls off a cliff at about midday as that wind swings round. So yeah, a big lot of wind shear and just generally pretty yucky. So let's look at the kind of confidence level. Yeah, we've obviously talked about the individual sailing areas, but generally the easterly is a little bit more fickle. We don't see the same sort of thermal enhancement, and we definitely don't see the kind of stability that comes with that. Directionally, I think we're quite certain. I can't see anything more than kind of like 20 degree deviation from my forecast, maybe a little bit less, ever being on the cards. And I, I, de- I definitely think that in the kind of settled part of the day, the wind speed is quite certain, whereas they in those transition periods, I can imagine there being quite a lot of uncertainty, potentially lower wind, and also just kind of those patchy holes that we obviously need to kind of expect and forecast for, because that can kind of dictate stuff. But yeah, generally looking a little bit better than last night, and yeah, we can kind of start to use that as a basis to build on. So yeah, thank you very much. I'll keep you updated, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much, and see you later.